You can use the entity classes in the model when you modify data. So for example, to add a customer, you can create an instance of the customer class and then add that to the customers collection in the object context. To update a customer, you'll create an instance of the appropriate customer class, typically through a query, and then you can just modify the properties of the class. And to delete a customer, you'll remove a specific instance of the customer class from the customer's collection. Now what does that look like in code? Well, if you're adding a customer, you can write code that looks like this. You can use the add-to-customers method of the object context and pass an instance of the customer class. So we'd create an instance of the customer class called newCustomer, and then we'd pass that to add-to-customers. To modify a customer, it's just simple property setting. To delete a customer, we can call the deleteObject method of the object context and pass an instance of the customer. Now, of course, this is all done in memory. We haven't actually saved anything yet. To send changes back to the data source, then we call the saveChanges method of the object context. So let's go see some demos of modifying data. So I have the LINQ to entities demo sample application running. Let's take a look at modifying data. So that would be example H. The first thing I want to do is bring down a list of beverages and display their current prices. So my query is going to be from product in products where category name equals beverages, bring back the product, and then display the product name and the price. Here are the current prices for beverages in the Northwind database. And these prices are probably significantly lower than the ones you're going to see, but I've been playing around with them. So these are the current prices. Now the next thing I'm going to do is reduce the prices by 10%. So as if these prices aren't low enough, I'm going to cut them by 10%. So I'm going to loop through each product in this collection of products and cut the price by 10%. Now that all, of course, has happened in memory. Nothing's been sent to the SQL Server. So the last query that was sent was the query to retrieve the beverages, but no modification queries have been sent yet. So now, to send the changes back, I'm going to call the saveChanges method of the object context. And when I do that, now we've obviously sent a number of updates. In fact, one for each product. And so if I go over to the SQL profiler, I can see that we've sent a number of updates. In fact, one update for each product whose price has been changed. Okay, so now I'm going to requery products and display the new prices. And as you can see, they're 10% lower than they were. Okay, next up, I want to add a customer. First, I want to see the customers in Washington. So I'll query customers where region is Washington and bring back the company name, the city, and the region, and then display those. So here are the customers in Washington. Now I want to create a new customer. So to do that, I'll create a new instance of the customer class, and using this new feature in Visual Studio 2008, I'll populate that instance at the same time I create it. So now new customer represents the customer I want to add. To add it, I can use the add-to-customers method of the object context and add this customer to the collection of customers. Because right now, new customer is basically an unattached customer. So when I call add-to-customers, now the object context includes this customer in the list of customers. But again, that's all local. I haven't actually added that customer to the database yet. That happens when I call saveChanges. And the SQL statement that gets sent is an insert statement. Then I'll rerun the query and show customers in Washington and show that Big Industries is now a customer. Now we'll modify some data. I'm going to retrieve information on this customer So I'll use first and pass to it customer ID equals big. So now customer before is big industries with the current information. I'm going to display the current contact name and contact title, and that is me. And now I'm going to change that information. And that's a simple setting of a property. I'll change the contact name property and the contact title property, and then save changes. And what gets sent to SQL Server is a simple update statement. And then I'll requery to prove that the information was saved. Current contact is Ken Getz. And now to complete the cycle, let's delete that customer. So the first thing I need to do is get a reference to that customer. So again, customer big represents this customer. And then I'll call the delete object method of the object context and delete this customer from the collection of customers. And then when I call save changes, LINQ to entities sends to the SQL Server a delete statement. Now I'll rerun the query to show customers in Washington, and that customer's not there. Let's look at modifying related data. I want to add an order for a customer. So the first thing I want to do is get a list of orders that have currently been placed for this customer, which is ALF key. So let's do that. Let's go down to here. So my query is from customers where customer ID is ALF key, bring back the company name and the orders, and then show me which order placed on what date and when it was required. Then show me the order number, the order date, and the required date. So these are the current orders for this customer. Now I want to create a new order. So let's skip down a couple lines, then we'll go back to that code we just skipped over. To create a new order, I create a new instance of the order class, and I need to supply the order date, which will be today, the required date, which is 7 days from today, and I need to populate this customer navigation property, which is an instance of the customer class. So I need to get that information for this customer. So I'll run this query, and here's the customer. And I'm going to set the customer navigation property to that. And then I'm going to default the shipping information to the customer's company name and address. Now the final piece of information I need to supply is the employee. And again, the order class does not have an employee ID property. It has an employee navigation property, which is an instance of the employee class. So I'm going to get information on this employee, employee number 3, and that is Janet Leverling. And then I'll set the employee navigation property to that. And now, new order is an instance of this order class. And I'm going to add it to the collection of orders belonging to this customer. So customer alfkey.orders.add new order. Now I want to create detail records for the order. So I'll create a new instance of the order detail class. And again, I don't specify the product ID. I specify the product navigation property. So first I'll retrieve information on product number 7, which is Uncle Bob's Organic Dried Pears. And I'll set the navigation property to that. And I'll set the unit price equal to the price of Uncle Bob's Organic Dried Pears, quantity 10, discount 0, and then add this new order detail to the collection of order details belonging to the new order. I'll do the same thing for product number 8. That's Northwood's Cranberry Sauce. Create a new order detail based on that. And finally, for product number 12, Queso Manchego La Pastora, create a new order detail based on that, and then save the changes. And when I do this, I send to the SQL Server 4 insert statements, one for the order, and then one for each of the order details. Now the order ID on this new order class is 1185. So I'm going to store that to this variable. The first thing I'm going to do is rerun the query that shows me orders for this customer. And we'll see that 1185 is in there. And now I want the details for that order. So I'll just query the order details where detail order ID equals 1185 and show the quantity, the product name, and the price. So there's the order. So it's very straightforward to modify data using the entities in the entity data model. So far in all of our examples, we've sent SQL statements to the SQL Server to retrieve data and to modify data. And what if you're using stored procedures? Well, you can create what's known as a function import to import a stored procedure to the entity data model. And then if your stored procedure returns an entity set, then you can call that stored procedure directly. So for example, we'll see a stored procedure in the Northwind database called customers in region. And that takes as an argument a region, and it returns a collection of customers. So since it returns an entity set, we'll be able to call it as a method of the object context. And in addition, we can configure the object context to use stored procedures when you call save changes. So in the previous demo, we saw sending insert, update, and delete statements. We can use stored procedures instead. So let's go see how to import stored procedures to the entity data model and then use them. I have the entity data model demo open, and this is the project we created a couple sections ago to see how to create an entity data model. I'm going to come back to this because I want to add some stored procedures to it. So I want to import stored procedures into the entity data model. So in the Server Explorer, I've connected to Northwind, and here are some stored procedures. Some of these are installed when I installed Northwind. Others I've added. So add customer, add order detail, customers in region, delete customer, and update customer. These are ones I wrote. So what I want to do is import into the data model update customer, delete customer, and add customer, because I want to be able to use these stored procedures when I work with customers, and then also this customers in region. Let's take a look at these first. So let's look at add customer. And this stored procedure takes as arguments the information for a customer and then executes an insert statement to insert that customer. Let's look at update customer. Again, that takes a number of procedures, all of the information for the customer, as well as the original customer ID. Now, if you don't change the customer ID and the original customer ID will be the same, but this stored procedure accounts for the fact that you might be able to change the actual customer ID. And then an update statement executes to update the customer. The delete customer stored procedure takes one argument, that's the customer ID, and then it deletes the customer from the customers table. And then finally, customers in region is going to take a region as an argument and then execute a SQL statement to bring back customers in that region. So I want to import these 4 stored procedures into the entity data model. To do that, I'm going to go into the model browser. Now in LINQ to SQL, I could just take these stored procedures and drag and drop them onto the designer. When I build an entity data model, it's not quite that simple. So what I'm going to do is go into the Northwind model.store node. This is the storage model, so this is working directly with the database. And I'm going to right-click on Stored Procedures and Update Model from Database. And this brings up my database objects. And now I'm going to go into the Stored Procedures, and I'm going to select Add Customer, Customers in Region, Delete Customer, and Update Customer. Now when I first created the entity data model, I could have selected these then, or I can come in this way and select them. So I'll click Finish. And now what I've done is I've added these to the storage model. They're not actually part of the conceptual layer yet, so the object context doesn't know about them. The model just knows that there are stored procedures in the database that I may or may not want to work with. So the next thing I need to do is import these into the entity data model. And I can do that by right-clicking on each of them and selecting Function Import. That brings up the Add Function Import dialog, where I can specify the name of the function. So what do I want this to be called in the object context? And then also, what does this return? Nothing, scalars, or entities. Well, add customer doesn't return anything, so I'll just select OK. I'll do the same thing for delete customer. I'll create a function import, and also for update customer. And then finally, for customers in region, this actually returns customers, so I'm going to select entities here, and I'm going to specify that this returns a collection of customer entities. So now if I go back up to the conceptual layer here, and I expand entity container Northwind entities and expand the function imports, here are my stored procedures, which are now imported into the model. So that's how I import stored procedures into the entity data model. So now let's go use these. So I'm going to go back to the LINQ to entities demo solution. And let's run this and see how we can use stored procedures. So the first example is stored procedures 1. And what I'm going to do is create a new instance of Northwind entities, which is my object context. And then I'm going to ask the user to enter a region, because I want to show all customers in that region. So let's enter a region WA for Washington. Now I want to call that stored procedure, customers in region. Because I've imported it into the entity data model, it now appears as a method of the object context. So now I can just call that directly, passing in the region, which is Washington. And of course, if we go into the SQL profiler and see what happens, we've executed that stored procedure, passing in Washington as an argument. And now I can display all of the customers in Washington. I can do this again for a different region. I presume there are customers in California. There they are. In our second example, we're going to want to use the add customer, update customer, and delete customer stored procedures for working with customers. Before we do that, we have a little bit more work to do. So let's go into our model, and we can do this here. We don't have to go back to the entity data model demo project to do this. Let me open up my model here. Let's get as much room as we can. So what I want to do is configure the object context to use those stored procedures when modifying customers. So to do that, I'll right-click on Customer and select Stored Procedure Mapping. And that shows me the mapping details window down here. And it gives me the opportunity to specify the insert, update, and delete function. And what I'm going to do is set those to those functions that we imported. So I'm going to click on Select Insert Function and then expand the drop-down list and select Add Customer. And now I can see a mapping of parameters in the stored procedure and the properties of the customer entity they map to. Now in this example, they map perfectly, so there's no additional work to do. Now I'll click Select Update Function and select Update Customer from that list. So here are the parameters, and the only thing I need to do is specify the original customer ID. So I'll click here and select from the drop-down list Customer ID. And then I want to specify that I want to use the original version of that, so I'll check this here. And then finally, I need to specify that I want to use the delete customer function. So I'll click here. Now what I need to do is identify the property in the customer entity that is the original customer ID. So once again, I'll select customer ID. And I don't have to select use original value. Okay, so now what I've done is configure the object context to use these 3 stored procedures when I make changes to customers. So in other words, when I call save changes, these stored procedures are going to be used to insert, update, or delete customers. So let's bring this back down. And if I wanted to do the same thing for order or order detail, I'd right-click and again select stored procedure mapping. So now let's save this and go run some demos. Now before we do that, let me show you one thing. Let's say I decide at some point that I don't want to use these stored procedures anymore. I want to go back to having LINQ to entities generate the SQL statement. Then I can come in here and delete this. And so now, once I save this, the object context will go back to creating insert statements when I insert a customer. So let's set this back to add customer. There we go. Save this and then run this. So our second example is stored procedures 2. And what I want to do now is add a customer. So I'll create a new instance of the object context, create a new customer, passing in all of the information in the constructor for the customer class. Then, as we did before, I'll add this customer to the collection of customers in the object context. That adds the customer locally in memory. And now when I save changes, here's what gets sent to the SQL Server, a call to the add customer stored procedure. So now let's call the customers in region stored procedure and display the customers in Ohio, and here's the customer we just added. Next, we'll make a change to this. So let's retrieve the customer from the data store by running this query. So now customer AAAAA is our customer. We're going to make some changes. AAAAA Consulting is hard to say, so we'll change the name to Pentuple A Consulting. Contact title, address. We're going to change some of this information. And now when we save changes, we send a call to the update customer stored procedure to SQL Server. And then let's display the changes. Then let's re-retrieve the customer and show that the changes have been applied. And then finally, oops, I already did it. Finally, I'd intended to step through this, but I hit F5 instead of F10, so I'll just show you the code. Let's bring back the customer and then call delete object on the object context. And then when we save changes, here it is. We make a call to the delete customer stored procedure and delete that customer. So there are now no customers in Ohio. So that's how you can use stored procedures in your entity data model. You import them as functions, and then a stored procedure that returns an entity set, like customers in region, you can just call directly as a method. And then your stored procedures for working with data, you can configure the object context to use those when you call save changes.